Hello and welcome back to Counterintuitive, a governance podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Sagar, a lecturer in the Department of Political Economy here at King's College London, and this podcast is made in association with the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. Each week on this podcast, I invite a speaker to come and defend an idea that is to some degree counterintuitive. I play the role of devil's advocate or sceptical inquirer in order to see where the ideas will take us. Of course, whether you agree with me or my speakers is, in the final instance, entirely up to you. Today on Counterintuitive, I'm speaking to Dr. Diana Popescu, who is a colleague of mine in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. Diana works on distributive justice, recognition theory, and the relationship between the two, in particular with respect to recognition struggles around disability rights, minority discrimination, and social exclusion. Today, however, I'll be speaking to Diana about the idea of universal basic income. The idea that the state should unconditionally give everybody money for free. Today on Counterintuitive, the Governance Podcast, I'm talking to my colleague, Dr. Diana Popescu, who's a lecturer here in the Department of Political Economy. Diana, welcome to Counterintuitive.
Hello, and thank you for having me, Paul.
No problem. So you're going to talk to us today about the idea of universal basic income, which is increasingly popular, but is still to many people a counterintuitive proposal or idea. So let's just begin, Diana. What is universal basic income?
Universal basic income is indeed a radical policy proposal. And it is universal in the sense that all individuals, all adults, but also some children, usually living in a certain territory, are supposed to get this income. It is basic in the sense that it is usually set around the poverty line, usually right at the poverty line or even lower. And it is an income in the sense that it's constituted by a cash transfer as opposed to other more means-tested benefits like, food stamps or other kinds of services. So the general idea in its most generic kind of formulation is a relatively simple one, but I guess you'll want to challenge me more on what each of these features means.
Why then universal? So let's start with the first one. Why should this be a universal income given to everybody?
This is actually what attracted me most about the idea of universal basic income. The fact that it comes with no strings attached, as opposed to some of the other welfare measures that do require individuals to prove that they are worthy, essentially, of receiving state assistance. So that's actually how I first encountered the idea. I was doing my work on social exclusion. And social exclusion is a notion that applies to those who fall through the cracks of the welfare system. And one of the things that you notice very quickly when you work on social exclusion is how the discourse about the socially excluded tends to punish them for being in need of assistance. So what you usually see is that people who fall through the cracks, who desperately need help, are blamed for their situation rather than help. So the reason why I think everyone should get this benefit, including those who are wealthy, is motivated to a very large extent by the situation of those who are at the bottom of the income distribution, because those are the ones who are most failed by the current welfare test. So in the same idea of being treated with dignity by the welfare state, I think that a universal dividend is also one that grounds the redistribution that's taken place, not in the needs of individuals, or not in the way in which they are deficient or they didn't manage to do something to achieve a certain income that is considered normal in their society, but in other notions such as solidarity. Or it's sometimes called universal basic income, a citizen's income, because it's meant to reward just the status of being a citizen and contributing in ways that sometimes can't be remunerated in a certain society. So actually, what is sometimes seen as an argument against universal basic income, the fact that it doesn't target the poor, for me, specifically, the poor do tend to benefit most, for me is actually one of the big advantages of universal basic income.
That's really great, because I suppose that is one of the most counterintuitive things about the idea of the UBI, that it should be everybody, including the rich, should get this too. And so maybe we could delve down a little bit. So at least for you, I imagine there's disagreement amongst different theorists here, but is this then primarily, or perhaps it's not one or the other, a policy based around efficiency? That the idea is that, look, if we just give this to everybody, although there'll be some people who don't need it, we'll make sure that everyone who does need it gets it? Or is it primarily motivated by a particular view of egalitarian justice, that, as you said, citizenship income, that insofar as you're a member of this community, you should be able to get this income that allows you to have a certain amount of dignity? Does one of those tend to take precedence for you, or in the field, or is it always a mix of the two?
That's a very, very good question. And the answer is that you tend to have a mix of the two. This is one of the reasons why, so the fact that different people have different motivations for preferring UBI, this is one of the reasons why you do have libertarians as well as Marxists supporting universal basic income, because it's an idea that makes sense for many different concerns that we might have. So Marxists, for instance, argue that if you give people enough money that they can say no to certain forms of employment, then what you will see is that individuals will pursue through their own means more worthwhile forms of employment than just the bottommost job that any employer could offer them. And in a way, even this idea that is, as I formulated it, one that is phrased in Marxist vocabulary, is one that might appeal to libertarians, right? Because the idea is that you empower people, you give them the autonomy to decide how they want to how they want to work. But the main problem that I see with the different justifications that you can have for universal basic income is that some libertarians argue that you should have the universal basic income in place, but you shouldn't have other welfare measures if you have the universal basic income. And this is actually a very smart argument, because some of them say, if the best defense that we can make for universal basic income is that individuals are better equipped to decide how to spend this income, better equipped than the state, which is something that the left also appreciates about UBI, then why not let individuals also decide how to spend all the money that now goes into, for instance, the NHS? Why not trust the individuals to spend all the money that is now being directed by the state into specific policies? So it's an uneasy alliance in a way, because when you think about the basic motivation, that is the motivation for taking away this kind of perfectionist hand that the state puts on benefits, then yes, the left and the right agree. But what makes UBI a sort of dangerous proposal is that maybe once you have it in place, these different justifications are going to pull in opposite directions with respect to what's going to happen with the welfare state more generally.
Could you just go into a bit more detail there? Is the idea that some libertarians think that once you deliver UBI, then you won't need a welfare state, and that's part of the motivation, whereas other people think, well, this would in fact be a way of taking the welfare state to the next level? Is that the distinction here?
Yes, pretty much. I think this also speaks to where do you get the money, because there is a simple answer to that question, where do you get the money for UBI? Because the libertarians are going to say, we are spending so much on people anyway in a welfare state, so why don't we just have all that money redelivered? And it's such an important question of just where does UBI leave the welfare state? Because what you want to have, if you're among the left-wing proponents of UBI, as I am, is to have most of the measures that you have now in place, and universal basic income on top of those. What tends to happen in actual policy proposals for universal basic income is that people are in favor of scrapping some benefits. For instance, food stamps would be something that you don't really need if people get enough money that they can buy food once a month. But and unemployment benefits would be another obvious candidate for a service of the welfare state that you can get rid of if you have universal basic income in place. But all the money that goes into education, for instance, I think it should be there. But it's more difficult to make an argument that people need education if they don't need a job to survive. So it's very much a site of struggle that's mostly unacknowledged, because the very idea of UBI itself is counterintuitive. This site of struggle that's going to come afterwards of where does that leave the welfare state, I think is mostly underexplored. And then all the disagreements that we have now between the left and the right will reappear. Although at this moment it seems that the left and the right both agree that this is a good idea.
I suppose, though, for somebody who may not have thought about this very much, an obvious rejoinder at this point is going to be, but who's going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for this? And so maybe we could get an idea of the sums that are involved. For example, in the UK, what do proponents of UBI suggest each person should receive as a unconditional basic income from the state every month? What kind of figures are we talking about?
Well, the most thought through project on this is the one developed in Scotland. They started thinking about this about 2 years ago. And we have a pretty good sense of what's going to be, because just in May, Nicola Sturgeon came out saying that they are in favor of it. And the sum they were talking about is 20 billion per year. That's going to fund about 5,500 or 5,600 pounds per year for, I guess, Scottish residents, adult Scottish residents, and 2,600 for children. And speaking of the fact that you basically can make a case that you have the money already there, 18.5 billion of that is going to come from revenue that's already being collected, but you just divert it. So that leaves you with $1.5 billion that is still to be collected. Like I said, because the welfare state in some countries is pretty big, you always have some pockets to reach into to pay for this. But my favorite answer to the question, how do you pay for universal basic income, is to say that poverty also costs money. So there's a lot of money that goes into tackling the health costs of poverty. If you have children in poverty, and this is actually one of the effects that has been most noticed in universal basic income, a reduction in child poverty and child obesity, that means a lifelong improvement of healthcare for those children who benefit as a result of their parents having UBI or themselves receiving universal basic income. Then you have mental health issues that all of the pilots say are greatly improved by having a universal basic income. And that means citizens who can work instead of taking sick days. In the UK, there's a lot of money that's being lost on people with mental health being hospitalized. So if the problems get very bad, then it's not just about taking a day off, it's about being inactive for several months. And it's about the costs that are currently unacknowledged of women going into the labor market and having to make ends meet both at home and in the labor market, with children usually losing out. And we can at the most generous level, that's close to the poverty line, for UBI, you would still be paying less than you would for putting criminals in jail. So a system that is better designed also cuts costs in many other ways. So it's not like you have this I don't know, this counterfactual in which there's no money being spent, and you have zero input, zero output, versus a system in which we have a lot of money that's coming through a universal basic income with some benefits attached. No basic income also comes with costs. So it might be an open question and an empirical question, just how much are you gaining, but you're definitely gaining something that is currently unaddressed. And these costs are usually just not acknowledged, because individuals are supposed to care for those themselves. Your mental health is your business. If you're a woman, having children is your business. But it's more and more acknowledged that that's not how a just society should work. So I guess instead of motivation being how do you make most money out of this, out of being a member of the state, we should think about what kind of society we want to be part of.
That's great. So moving back then away from the efficiency question, back to
Mm-hmm.
the egalitarian question, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
isn't there a reply that comes, but hang on a minute, there's something fundamentally unfair about
Mm-hmm.
UBI. It's presented as, an egalitarian proposal to help
Mm-hmm.
everybody, but at least
Mm-hmm.
some of this money is going to come from general taxation. So there's a question of
Mm-hmm.
why that taxation should be redistributed, not just to the
Mm-hmm.
poor, who we might all agree, look,
Mm-hmm.
it's good to help the poor, those without work, but
Mm-hmm.
presumably significant numbers of people might simply withdraw from the labour market if they received
Mm-hmm.
universal basic income,
Yes.
choose not to
Mm-hmm.
work. And there's two problems there. One, that will reduce the overall tax take, so that's going to make it
Mm-hmm.
harder to pay for. And secondly, isn't it simply just not right that some
Mm-hmm.
people should live lives of leisure? I'm tempted to say that if
Mm-hmm.
I had UBI, I would stop coming to work and I just go rock climbing all the time. I could probably survive on UBI, just live out of my van. But
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't be fair, right, for you
Mm-hmm.
to go to work and pay your taxes to fund my lifestyle. So
Mm-hmm.
isn't there
Mm-hmm.
a powerful egalitarian rejoinder to UBI?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you phrased the question in a very interesting way, because it's exactly how Philip Paris or Van
Right,
Parijs
exactly.
replies to it in his famous article, "Why Surfers Should Be Fed." And it's actually a play upon well, not a play upon words, but it's the inspiration for that title comes jointly from the fact that Rawls says that you shouldn't fund, as a matter of justice, the lifestyles of people who are not contributing.
I think Raw's example
To
was surfers, right? Beach bums who just lived
Mhm.
on the beach and went
Yes.
surfing all day. So I think sounds like a great way to live.
Yes, exactly. So this was one part of the inspiration to speak directly to this category that was directly excluded by Rawls from those who would be entitled to benefits. And also, around the time that Van Parijs was writing this article, there was an entire discussion in Malibu about how the welfare provision there should have not been extended to the surfers who were just coming in to pursue this sort of beach bum lifestyle. And Van Parijs makes a very interesting argument, which is that it's not as if a work crazy society is the default. Why should that be the default? It's just that we have a work bias in our societies that make us see it as such. So a society that is truly impartial between different versions of the good life would be one in which you would end up subsidizing even the lifestyles of beach bums. And why should you do that? Well, he identifies three kinds of resources that you as a state would be able to tax to get the revenue to pay for a universal basic income. And the most interesting of those three resources is having a job itself. So the other ones are gifts and bequests, which in the UK actually they are taxed, but in other countries they are not. So you have this kind of transaction that produces a lot of money for recipients. Let's tax it, and then the revenue can go into universal basic income. The second stream has to do with technology. So you have technological advancements that have been produced as a result of hundreds and hundreds of years of technological advancements. Why should we see them as belonging to someone, specifically people who use them to make money? Why can't we see them as things that belong to the common pool, and then those who use it can pay for a dividend that should go to those who don't. And the third stream, so this is the one that I like best, is that even having a job should be seen as having a scarce resource, because there are all these goods that are associated with labor, with being in employment. And then the fact that you don't want to have a job, like the beach bums don't, is not something that diminishes the value of the resource. It's just like having a piece of land. The fact that you're not using the piece of land does not diminish the value of that piece of land. So people who choose a different kind of lifestyle are enabling those who do want to be work crazy to pursue this kind of lifestyle. So the work crazy would have to pay this dividend that goes to the work shy, for the simple fact that in a society in which there is a scarcity of jobs, and most Western societies are like that, especially now during the pandemic, those who don't pursue a job even because they don't want it are still giving others some kind of service. And I really like this kind of argument that says, well, you don't have to be actively in gainful employment to promote a benefit. And I think this kind of argument is one that a lot of the political theorists working on UBI have been tapping into, but not only political theorists. So the UBI trend has seeped into Silicon Valley lately. And one argument that people make is that people's data that you use on social media, for instance, should be seen as a kind of resource that you tax, or a kind of technology that those who benefit from it, which are usually the people who own social media outlets, or even advertising companies, and use that data, they should pay a dividend to the citizens who only put their data in, because the sheer fact that you are not personally gaining anything from your data is a little bit like having a plot of land that you don't actually use, but someone else does. So this is a kind of argument that I really like, that is in favor of UBI, looking at the fact that not doing something is sometimes a benefit. The Green party in the UK is also advocating UBI, and a natural way of funding UBI, looking at what people don't do as a benefit, is to say, well, people who are producing a lot of carbon dioxide should pay a tax, on a very high tax on what they are producing, and then you would have a lot of employers who would be putting a lot of money into a common pot that you then would divide to everyone. So these would be sort of the kind of philosophical arguments for UBI. But what's more interesting, I guess, is that the pilots that we have seen on universal basic income disprove this kind of worry that people who are on universal basic income would not work. The oldest kind of naturally occurring universal basic income experiment is probably the one in Alaska that has been going on for over 40 years. And the studies there show that when the dividends that Alaskans receive every year goes up by a little bit, actually employment goes up by a little bit as well. So what happened in Alaska is that the state had this peculiar legislation that if a resource would be discovered, it wouldn't belong to the person who discovered it or the plot of land it was attached to, but would belong to sort of everyone in the state in common. And this discovered oil. So since this was set up in the late 70s, so late 70s, 80s, everyone in Alaska starts getting this yearly dividends of, it could be anywhere between $300 as it was in the beginning, or $2,000 as it is now. And you get it by just proving that you're living in Alaska. And what they found with respect to employment is that actually employment grew up for grew for a little bit for men, and for women, they found that women tend to work 1 hour per month less in years when the dividend is a bit higher, as opposed to years when it's a bit lower, suggesting that they have more discretionary power over how to use their time. And the pilots that are more directed, not naturally occurring, that we see now, and the Finnish experiment was the one that most recently yielded results, show the same thing, that unemployment doesn't go up. And what's interesting about the Finnish case is that their version of universal basic income was directed specifically at people who are unemployed. And they found that without getting people to prove their willingness to work or getting them to apply to jobs all the time, you had the same result, that people were actually looking for employment. They were maybe taking more time to retrain, which is something that the welfare state doesn't really give you time to do. You're supposed to take the first job that they find, that you can find. And also the self-employment ratio went up by a little bit. So actually this kind of fear that people tend to have, that if given a universal basic income, people wouldn't continue to work, is ill-founded. And I'm going to tell you one more factoid about that before you challenge me, probably.
Go on, carry on, yeah.
Which comes from the research that's been recently conducted by the Nobel Prize in Economics winners Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, on universal basic income and people's attitudes. So what they found is that people say, I wouldn't stop working, but everyone else would. And everyone says that, right? So most people, when asked, would you continue working, say, yes, of course, I'm one of the good ones. But they think everyone else is one of the bad ones who doesn't work. But if everyone thinks like that about everyone else, it's not true at the same time. So I think this speaks to the human nature of thinking you're slightly better than everyone else, and everyone thinks so.
So that's really interesting, because so you've given me a really good answer there about why, at a philosophical level, especially for those with more egalitarian impulses, this can get around this objection. And you've given lots of evidence that the facts on the ground seem to be that it's not true that people will give up work, and that a lazy minority will become parasitic on the hardworking majority. It just doesn't seem to be what happens. The worry I would have, and to push back, would say, unfortunately, when it comes to politics, philosophical arguments and the facts aren't often what cut it. And if you look at, say, the history of the United States and Britain in the past 30 or 40 years, we've seen enormous electoral gains accrued to parties of the right by demonizing particular, in America you had the idea of the welfare queen, in Britain it's the benefit scrounger, and these narratives of you are being unfairly forced to fund the feckless lifestyles of the undeserving poor has been extremely powerful. So even though you may have the arguments on your side, how is UBI possible in the kinds of democracies, maybe different in Sweden, maybe different in Finland, but say in Britain and the United States, is there not an impassable democratic barrier between the theory and the practice?
Well, in terms of context, the current climate seems to be one that pushes quite a lot against this narrative of the welfare queen or the benefit scrounger, because what you see now is that people who are furloughed, who are forced to stay at home, actually hate it. So they would much rather do something useful. You also have, at least in the UK, an army of 750,000 volunteers who have signed up to help with the NHS discharging patients or bringing food or things like that. So instead of saying whoever is not in gainful employment is not doing anything, we have a very focal point of people who are doing a huge service to all of us without receiving anything in return. So that strengthens the case that many UBI advocates make, that if you give people money, they would rather try to do something that they personally find beneficial for their societies rather than not do any kind of employment, any kind of work or labor at all. I think it's not surprising that in this climate we see Scotland publicly committing itself to universal basic income program. You see discussions in Spain. We saw the Pope saying that a universal basic income is, I think he said, the only way of really securing workers' rights, because you have this exit option, that if your rights aren't respected in the labor market, you can just exit it. And my favorite argument in favor of this, which is something that I'm actually writing on for a collection of papers on COVID-19 and philosophy, one of the many, I presume, that will have this title, is that there's more social solidarity. So our context is one in which this rhetoric that we are all in this together is much stronger. It has done wonders for the NHS, even though discussions of privatizing it had started rearing their ugly head before the crisis. So in a way, what the COVID-19 context does is refocus our attention on the importance of social solidarity in a way that the post-World War II period has done. And it's also a context in which the truth, the very simple truth that worth and wealth are not matched up is starting to be very prevalent, because what we see is that Deliveroo drivers have been essential workers, or garbage men have been essential workers, and bankers, no. What have the bankers ever done for us? And this is exactly the kind of context, I think, where ideas about universal basic income can be very, very strong. And one of the ways in which I would say we can fund it going forward, and thinking of the COVID-19 crisis, is to say, maybe we won't even interfere and redistribute anything that you guys have managed to acquire now, speaking to the rich. But look, we've all been in this together through the 2020 moment. There's no telling how much a volunteer contributed, or how much a person who stayed home would have been a super spreader contributed, or how much a banker contributed. So let's take, I don't know, the GDP for 2020 as a baseline, and say for whatever else we regain when the economy is going to speed up again, 10% of that, let's divide it equally among all of us. Because I think that's what really worked in Alaska. It wasn't saying, here we are, it would be nice to have a universal basic income, how about you give us some money? It was saying, well, if in the future it just so happens that there's going to be a source of wealth, great wealth discovered, let's just share that between all of us. So I think the present moment is one where the concerns that you mentioned are quite thin, but also the opportunities for setting up a system that everyone will perceive as fair is very ripe. So I'm personally optimistic.
Pushing on the same kind of issue, though, one objection that I've heard to UBI, or at least one worry that is raised, is that this policy would, of course, have to interact with other factors of our political reality. And for example, again, countries like the UK, the USA, immigration is going to be a major topic of worry.
Yes.
And one thought here is, well, what happens to the already fraught and almost violent debate around, say, naturalizing of Mexican citizens in America, a hugely controversial and difficult moment in American politics where they don't know how to solve this. What happens to the political right if suddenly the proposition is that if you get US citizenship, it comes with a paycheck every month? Would that not turn an already toxic debate completely supernova? And that might not be a reason to really worry about something like UBI.
Yes, I think that is indeed a big worry with what happens to those who you leave out, and how do you establish the boundaries? First of all, because it might seem arbitrary sometimes. who you leave out? If you say it's only citizens, what about people who have lived here for 15 years? What about the Windrush generation? People who see so many of their rights being stripped away. UBI would be just one more reason to want to police membership. So I think that is absolutely right. What I would say is that since this discourse is prevalent right now, when we don't have universal basic income, why would you think it's necessarily going to be more more damaging with universal basic income? Because yes, I don't know, the benefits of leaving people out would increase in financial terms, but they would decrease in the sense of the, I don't know, existential risk, let's call it, that you might perceive as something that happens when migrants come over, because at the moment, when you don't have a universal basic income, when whatever the welfare state can afford to give you, that's it, you do perceive welfare migrants as a direct threat to how much you are getting. But if you motivate the universal basic income that is going to be given to people in terms of social solidarity, if you give everyone a stake in growing as an economy, then more people, more migrants would actually mean a bigger labor force. And if you don't say migrants are going to be given a universal basic income in day one, you say they have to be here, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years, something like that, then there is an argument to be made that for a while you will have migrants putting in the work but not getting the benefits. So in terms of, I don't know, discursive strategies that the left would, let's say, would have available to argue that, yes, migrants continue to be a good element of our societies, even though it might appear that we have this benefit that is now being distributed among more people. Now, I think the resources and the psychological resources that the UBI affords people, that they're less afraid of what's going to happen with them, might be a counterbalancing factor. So unfortunately, I don't see UBI as something that's going to end these discussions about immigration forever, but I am optimistic that we're not going to see them get much worse than they currently are. And maybe if people become absolutely certain that they will retain this benefit regardless of what happens, you might see a reduction that now exists because of this anxiety that would be reduced. But this is all very speculative. So, this is how, as a UBI optimist, I'm thinking about this, but, feel free to disagree with this.
I suppose a similar connected worry would be one that I've had myself, which is UBI is often presented reasonably as a way of liberating people, liberating them from unfair work practices, because, as you said before, they would have an exit option. If you could quit your job knowing you wouldn't starve and your children wouldn't starve, that in a way makes you more free. It gives you independence and security, and that's obviously benefit. But then a worry comes, but doesn't it just shift the dependence back another level to the level of the state? And of course, we UBI proponents usually are thinking of UBI in terms of a nice welfare state model where this is impartially administered and delivered on an egalitarian basis. But constitutions change and governments change and the function of the state changes. And if everybody is directly dependent on the state for their subsistence and survival, there's a worry, surely, that UBI in the wrong hands becomes a tool of control and dependence at a level even more terrifying than that of, say, corporate dependence. There's a worry that by intending to liberate people, we may actually open the door to something which could have the opposite effect.
That's a very good that's a very legitimate worry to have. Of course, it's something that the welfare state does as well. So you can't you can't say this is something new that UBI introduces, but maybe you want to say it introduces it on a different scale. I personally think that the kind of conditionality that the welfare state is more damaging than what we would get with UBI. I work on the Roma minority, and one of the things that you see with welfare state interventions on the Roma is that they do more harm than good, specifically for this reason. There was this policy to give employers more money if they hired Roma people. Sounds good, right? But what happens is that people who were employed already, Roma people who were employed already, were first, by these companies, were first fired by them and then rehired with the benefits. So instead of having more inclusion of the Roma in the labor market, what you actually had was that people who were comfortably included because they were good workers were now part of this sort of dependent category that was created by this policy that wanted to that had this perverse effect. So I think that the welfare state already creates these kinds of problems, and indeed it could be the case that they affect fewer people, but that's also something that makes the people who are affected less powerful in dealing with them. And that's something that speaks to the kind of conditionality that current welfare states do, that they might create different categories that are all disadvantaged by the conditional measures that they put in place, but they're not disadvantaged in the same way. So in terms of the ability of people to push back against these welfare measures, they are less empowered to do so than under a UBI scheme in which people would be equally affected. So this is something that you see in Alaska when the benefit goes beyond a certain level, that because since it's dependent on oil, as the oil prices go down or up, the stipend that you get from the oil also varies. So everyone is involved in the scheme, and therefore the pressure that the citizenry can put on the state is pretty high. So in a way, it's like Machiavelli's argument: when something affects the people, who are the majority, then if you're the prince, if you're the leader, you better watch out. Whereas if you divide people into categories that are all negatively affected, but negatively affected in different ways, as you do with current welfare state measures, then you can control what's happening with these people, and you can prevent them from voicing their concerns. So I think the empowerment that comes from UBI is also a political form of empowerment. And this is what people who refer to UBI as a citizen's income tend to focus on quite a lot, that you also create equal opportunities for voicing your concerns, which if you have someone who can spend their whole day just watching TV and tweeting versus someone who has to feed for children and work 2 jobs, they don't have equal voices. Whereas the universal basic income actually creates equality of voice and can bring the citizenry together.
Just to bring our conversation to a close, you've already mentioned that COVID-19, of course, has changed, well, it's changed everything really, but it's also refocused the debate on UBI and potentially made it seem more plausible than it did 12 months ago. It's interesting though, because until COVID-19, the main argument that we heard in some quarters for UBI was everything's going to be automated. AI, algorithms, robots are going to end up doing so much of what was normally done by humans that we're going to have UBI, because otherwise societies are going to collapse. I was wondering, how do you think these two issues, the COVID-19 crisis and the automation revolution, are likely to interact? Do you think that it's only a matter of time until we have to introduce UBI, or is it still much more a policy that's going to need to be fought for and won politically?
That's a very good question, because indeed, this kind of argument for UBI, that you will have massive shifts in the labor market, something that's sometimes referred to as the fourth industrial revolution, is indeed a powerful motivator for universal basic income, and especially the Silicon Valley types buy into this argument a lot. And I think that it does have a strong motivating force, in the sense that, just like we have our current welfare system motivated by the fact that people were quite likely to lose their health, their house during the Second World War and immediately afterwards. Now, everyone can say, we don't know how automation is going to affect each and every one of our jobs, from surgeons to teachers, to bus drivers. There's just no telling how automation is going to advance next, and whose job is going to be made redundant. And instead of all of us who are going to lose our jobs to be dependent on Job Center Plus and their policy of giving us, the first job that's available rather than retraining, wouldn't it be better for us to have this discretionary income that we could use to retrain, to maybe start our own business in due time, something like that? So definitely this is a strong motivating factor that could just compound what we see with the COVID-19, where again we have massive job loss and there's no telling who is it going to affect next, because in maybe February 2020, it might have appeared that working as a checkout clerk in a supermarket is a much more vulnerable position than being a lecturer, and now we're not so sure about that. So this kind of uncertainty is I think the same kind of argument that you get from automation, and both of these together would form the same kind of motivation that we had for welfare state measures. So I think that as far as the argument for UBI goes, then definitely you can see these two together, and there is a potential to see more politicians advocating for UBI. I mean, Andrew Yang in the United States, who was not distinguished, I think, by much, is a figure that everyone talks about now because he was a UBI advocate. So it's possible that we see more politicians sort of trying to tap into this insecurity and trying to provide this kind of solution. I personally think that automation is something that we have encountered quite a lot since the 80s onwards. And there's a lot to be said for our capacity to adapt to new technologies, integrate them, rather than have massive job loss. But as a UBI advocate, I'm very willing to put these kinds of arguments together and say, yes, we need it now.
Diana, thanks very much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.